Hi, Nancy.
Hello.
We have 32 people signed up.
And can you hear me? Let me see.
I can.
Okay, great. I just switched my audio over to my computer rather than my headphones, so we're now good to go.
Okay. Jules is going to be the co-host, and I'm going to monitor the chat.
Great. Various binders are not in the screen there.
Hi. How is it in Maine? Oh, you're
I'm
muted.
actually back in Boston now.
Oh,
We
okay.
came back at the beginning of the month, or actually the beginning of last month, I should say. So now over a month ago.
Okay.
Time flies. I wanted to see, Anne, has it been enabled that I can share my screen? I'm not sure that I'm seeing that option.
Let me see. Hold on. Let me see. I'm going to go to more.
Okay.
Should I do
Oh,
spotlight?
I think, yeah, you did. I just got that new option.
So is it spotlight for everyone? Is that what I do?
No, I think it should be fine. I actually just expanded my screen, so
Okay.
so now I have that option.
Do you want to be a co-host too?
That's okay.
Okay.
The only difference is, can I see the questions directly? Maybe not if I'm not a co-host.
Okay, I'll make you a co-host.
Yeah.
There you go.
Great. So has your library opened all the way?
We're doing
No.
curbside. Actually, a lot of libraries that did a little more like grab and go, or even going back to curbside because the numbers are going up.
Yeah. Yeah, they're going up here too, but it seems like Michigan is on a much faster trajectory.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually had to get tested today. I was exposed, so I had to wait 3 hours.
3 hours is not as bad as when they first started doing them. I had friends who were in line for hours.
Yeah. It's just drive up, so you stay in your car, and but I'm negative.
Yeah. That's good.
I know.
It's good that you know already too.
Yeah.
They're doing no reason testing down at Rite Aid at 7 in Wyoming, among other places, but they're doing a community incident study down there.
I don't see in the waiting room. Oh, there's Joel. Okay.
Hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Jules.
I can't hear you. Sure what. Hello?
Hi. We can hear you. Hi, Sue.
Ann?
Yeah, I, it looks like you're muted, Jules. On your end.
Hello?
Hi.
Oh, that's better. Whatever that was, now it works. Okay. How are you?
Doing well.
Amy?
Well, hi, Amy.
I'm good. I see Jules, we unmuted you.
That's now I can at least hear.
We can hear you.
Good. I can hear you too. So somebody should tell my wife to stop combing her hair in front of the camera.
I didn't comb my hair.
You can
No
mute
comb.
her.
I'm drinking something though.
Nice. Can you mute her? All right. All right.
Yeah, you want to make Jules co-host so he can
I
see the
did.
chats as well? Okay,
I did, and Nancy's a co-host also.
good. Hi, Nancy. It's nice to meet you.
Hello, nice to meet you too.
Yeah, talk about pressed into service. She lives in Boston, for God's sake. She's like, do I have to do all this for you in Huntington Woods?
Yeah, so my Michigan connections run deep.
Good. You went to school here, right?
I did, and I have a couple of close family friends who are in Michigan, so I have always visited a lot.
Oh, good.
She is very good friends with Justice McCormick on the Michigan.
I would
Supreme
not
Court.
go that far.
Well, I'm good friends with her, and I say you're good friends with her. So I'm the moderator. I get to say these things.
You're good friends by default.
Right.
Our new county treasurer is joining us. That's nice.
Hey, hello there, Commissioner.
Hi there. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. I am chasing after two little ones, so I will not be on video, but I will be here tuned in.
That's all right. That's all right.
Hi, Amy.
Hi, Robert. All right, well, I'm gonna mute myself and let me know if you need anything. All right, Ian?
Okay, thanks, Amy.
Okay. Whenever you want to start, Ann. 7, you want to 7:01, you can go ahead and get
All right.
started here, I think.
Do you want to introduce Nancy?
Sure.
Okay.
So good evening, everyone. My name is Jules Olsman. I'm a Huntington Woods City Commissioner, and I want to welcome everybody tonight to the first in a series of Zoom video presentations that we have worked to create with the library with Ann's help. This follows up to the issues that have in recent months that have come to light regarding the anti-racism policy that the city has adopted, and issues that pertain to that topic. And one of those issues is what are called, pertains to what are called restrictive covenants in real estate deeds. And these are provisions contained in probably almost every deed in almost every house in Huntington Woods that was built, I'm going to say probably, or built and or sold after the 1970s, that restrict the ability of the owner of the property to sell the house to anybody who is African American. In some cases, the restrictive covenants apply to Jews and other ethnic groups. And so we're here tonight to explore this topic with somebody who has proven that she's extremely knowledgeable in the area. And our guest speaker tonight is Nancy Welch, who is an attorney in Boston. She's with DLA Piper, which is a large national law firm, where the focus of her practice is on real estate. She works on a wide range of transactional real estate matters, and is very knowledgeable in this area. She went to law school at the University of Michigan Law School. She also has an undergraduate degree from her undergraduate degree is from Wellesley College. During her time at Michigan, she was editor-in-chief of the Michigan Journal of Gender and Law. She has a very distinguished publishing record, and she's a very substantive person, very knowledgeable on this topic. I first became aware of Ms. Welch when I came across an article that she wrote, which should be available to every person who's joining us. It's called Racially Restrictive Covenants in the United States, A Call to Action. And it's a very thorough, detailed analysis. It's not a law review article for those of you who think you might be sleeping before you got past the first page, but it's actually a very well-written periodical article that explains these covenants, explains how they came into being and why they persisted, who benefited from them and who lost from them, and where we are with them today. So I'm very pleased to welcome Nancy Welch to the city of Huntington Woods, and turn the program over to her.
Thanks, Jules, and hi, everyone. It's good to be back in Michigan, even over Zoom instead of in person. As Jules mentioned, I did spend 4 years in Michigan. I got my dual degree in law and urban planning at the University of Michigan, and I left there in May of 2018. So I'm ready to return if and when this ever ends. So I put together a short presentation that I think will help, break down some of the issues, to provide some kind of visual aids. So I'm going to share my screen, but before I do, I just, out of curiosity, if you could show me by a show of hands, who is interested in this because you have found that on your deed, you have some kind of restriction. It looks like Greg and Tower. Yeah, it's actually really common, and a lot of people don't know why, and they also don't know what they can do about it or what it even means. So the focus of this will be, on a practical level, the history of the racial restrictive covenants and why they're still there. So let me go ahead and share my screen so you can follow along. All right, can everyone see? I'm gonna take that as a yes. All right, so I'm going to start with a high-level view of what racially restrictive covenants are, why they exist, and why we should care about them. Racially restrictive covenants were widespread tools of discrimination used by white homeowners and white developers and white banks and the government to prevent the migration of people of color, and particularly Black Americans, into their neighborhoods in the first half of the 20th century. Actually, this photo is from a community in Washington, D.C. I tried to find one from Michigan, but unfortunately, this is the best one I could find. And actually, it's from a mapping project in DC, which I would highly recommend that you visit the site. The organization is Prologue DC. They've captured a bunch of images and newspapers from this time period, which are interesting for anyone who's exploring this topic further. So racially restrictive covenants have not been enforceable since 1948, and they've been illegal since 1968. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that distinction is. But for all intents and purposes, you know, it's now been, let's say, 50 to 70 years since, you know, we should have stopped seeing these. And yet, it's really common to see them in your chain of title and in your home deeds and such because of the nature of covenants and racially restricted covenants. Quite frankly, it's just hard to get rid of them, and we'll talk about why that is. But it's due to a, you know, just a general system of our chain of title. And so while they're still unenforceable and illegal, I would tell you that I think that they still have a serious potential to cause harm. They have caused harm, and I think they continue to. And we'll talk about that more. But I do want to be clear, I don't think that this is the most pressing issue facing us today in terms of, you know, racial injustice in the United States. I think that there are, you know, much more systemic issues in play, and this is only one tool of systemic racism and segregation that has been used historically and which we still see the legacy of today. So I don't want to say that if we get rid of racially restricted covenants, then like there's no more racism and, you know, no more segregation, that we've solved the problem. So even if we get rid of them, nothing's going to change in that way. That said, I think that understanding why they're there will help us confront our history. And by confronting our history, we can maybe take more steps to repair the damage that has been done. And so then one last thing before we jump in fully is that, you know, by dint of the topic, some of the things we're going to be talking about are, quite frankly, offensive and hurtful. And, you know, I don't want that to stop anyone from engaging in what is a hard conversation, because I think good things can come of hard conversations, but I also want you to be aware that if something strikes you as hurtful, it's because it is. And, you know, to be sure that you're taking care of yourself as we're walking through this. Okay, so here's a little roadmap for what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start with the really dry part, which is what the heck is a covenant? And I'm doing that first, mainly so that we can get it out of the way, right? But even so, I think it's hard to have a conversation about the history and then also why they persist without understanding what a covenant is. So after we step through that, we're going to go to a brief history of racially restrictive covenants in the United States. And the purpose of this, I hope, is to demonstrate to you that this is not an accident. You know, our pattern of segregation in the US was an intentional act and continues to be an intentional act. And this is one tool of it. It was not the only tool, and there are a couple others we'll touch on today. But, you know, because it was something that was done intentionally, it is something that we should be intentional about fixing. And then once we go through that, I'll talk about, again, kind of the harm that these racially restrictive covenants continue to cause. And I'll propose a couple of options for addressing them. And this might be where people who have racially restrictive covenants in their deeds might be particularly interested. And the short answer is that there's not like a short silver bullet solution, but there are a couple of options out there, some which require legislative action and some which will require a lawyer. Okay, and then we'll go to questions. So hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end to go through any questions that you might have, but you're also welcome to post them in the chat. I think Anne is monitoring them, and you know, we can go through those at the end. All right, so what the heck is a racially restrictive covenant? All right, at a high level, a covenant, not a racially restrictive covenant, but a covenant, is defined as a binding promise or obligation to do or not do a particular act. And in the case of real estate, this is usually in your deed or your homeowners association declaration. And if a party who is promising or covenanting to do something fails to fulfill their promise, their covenant, then the holder of that promise, the covenantee, may sue to enforce the covenant in a court of law. So your remedy is to go to the court of law and say, you know, so-and-so promised to do this, they're not doing it, I want you to make them to do it, okay? Racially restrictive covenants, not racially restrictive covenants, but restrictive covenants are a subset of covenants. And basically that's the negative covenant, right? You're saying you cannot do something, not that you must do something, but you cannot do something. And they have a pretty lengthy history in terms of, you know, the US. They started to emerge more widely used at the early 20th century. And mainly that was to restrict use in sensitive areas. So you cannot create a brickyard in my residential neighborhood, that kind of thing. And they continue to be very common. It's not unconstitutional to have a covenant. I every day have to deal with covenants and documents and understand them. And so, you know, there are also other uses of it. For example, the city of Houston, which is the largest city in the US that does not have zoning, does restrict its uses through covenants. So that's another use of it. But again, as long as they're not running afoul of the Constitution, they're totally fine. And that's the chief distinction between a restrictive covenant and a racially restrictive covenant, which is illegal and unenforceable. So racially restrictive covenants are, just generally speaking, agreements between buyers and sellers of property that limit the covenantor, the person who's making the promise, their property rights, usually appearing in like the deed instrument. So the deed, the declaration of your homeowners association, that kind of thing. And typically what they say is that the covenantor will not sell, rent, or lease property to minority groups, and in particular, as Jules mentioned, Black Americans or Black people. So I provided some typical language for you here. I actually saw a couple of restrictions from Huntington Woods, which Amy shared with me, and they're all very similar, actually. So it's kind of interesting as you line them up, you know, next to each other, the similarities are much more than the differences between these kinds of documents. And you know, who they're trying to restrict varies, but generally it's a minority group. Okay, so there are kind of two broad categories of racially restrictive covenants. There are what I would call proactive covenants and reactive covenants. So proactive covenants are kind of like the fancy ones. They're ones that were created and applied by developers who were preparing like greenfield development of, you know, suburban tracts of land where they're creating, you know, hundreds of houses in one go. Levittown is the classic example of that in New York, and similar developments across the United States. And as we'll discuss, part of the reason why those developments often have these kinds of restrictions is because they were actually required to provide them as part of their acquisition of an FHA loan from the government. So again, this is something that the government was requiring them to do. And so, you know, a couple of other examples, if you've ever been to Kansas City, J.C. Nichols was a big developer there and developed these really interesting neighborhoods, you know, with beautiful homes and lots of amenities, and all of those have racially restrictive covenants. My parents' neighborhood in Houston has a racially restrictive covenant in a lot of the deeds. Reactive covenants are like the Tupperware party of racially restrictive covenants. So these are where you'd have neighbors making agreements between neighbors, knocking on each other's doors, agreeing kind of haphazardly or, you know, on a case-by-case basis that they would like to implement these. And so these are, generally speaking, are maybe a little less polished, if you will, and were historically more open to some kind of, argument against them on the basis that they failed to get a signature or some kind of other legal gap. And I also just want to point out this picture here. I included it because it actually is of a group who, at the time that racially restrictive covenants were really taking off, did a lot of work in documenting it and speaking out against it. So it wasn't as though everyone was going along with it. There were people at the time who were taking note and saying that this was not okay. Okay, so I want to go over the kind of structure of a covenant, because I think if you don't understand this, you're not going to understand why it is that they're still in your deed. So on the left, we have the covenantor, the person who's promising to do something. And on the right, we have the covenantee, the person who's benefiting from the promise. And then down at the bottom, we have our current owners of each of those properties, right? And the current owner continues to be bound by the covenant, and the current owner continues to benefit from the covenant. And that's because of the way that we have done title in our Anglo-American system of property law, right? So as long as there is, a couple of legal requirements, I've kind of put them out there for you, but you don't really care. It's writing intent, notice, touch and concern, privity on both the horizontal and vertical planes. That's when it can be enforceable at the bottom. And this sticky quality is really what makes it impossible to get rid of a covenant ad hoc. But it's also something that can be hard to understand, because it can be tempting to say, well, I didn't promise this, why should I be bound by the promise? And the fact is that other than a racially restrictive covenant, which you are not bound by that promise because it is illegal and enforceable, if there's a covenant in your deed, you are bound by it. All right. So now I'm going to go over the kind of history of it. And so, there are pretty widespread tools of discrimination during the first half of the 20th century. By the time that the Supreme Court ruled that they were unenforceable in 1948, there was an estimation that over half of the houses that were built in the period between 1900 and 1948 have these kinds of covenants in place. So if you think about how much housing was actually built, especially right after the war, that's a lot of houses. All right, so they first actually emerged in California and Massachusetts. And I mention this because I think in our popular culture, we have this myth that racism is stronger in the South. And as someone who lives in Boston, I can tell you that's absolutely not the case. And I will also say that some of the earliest restrictions actually appeared in a neighborhood that's very close to where I live in Brookline, Massachusetts. And so, within a decade, they had really started to take off. And partly that was because of other things that were happening at the time. There was also a rise of the sundown town. I don't know if that's a term that you're familiar with, but this was basically policy, sometimes a law that would say that people of a certain background or color or race were not permitted to be in a town after a certain period, and if they were likely to be killed. And then similar adoption of racial zoning ordinances. And these are where you have racial restrictions that are in the zoning code itself. Now, in 1917, the Supreme Court in Buchanan v. Worley actually declared that these zoning restrictions were illegal. And so in their basis, in case you were interested, is that it interfered with the core property right of alienation, the right to sell your property. And so after Buchanan v. Worley, when the zoning option was no longer available, there was an even greater interest in keeping out people through racially restrictive covenants. And in particular, as suburban development really took off and we had this professionalization of the real estate industry and the accompanying bureaucracy that goes with that, with real estate boards and the development of real estate ethics, we see more and more kind of calcification of racially restrictive covenants and more an embrace on an institutional level of incorporating those. So, and then in 1926, the Supreme Court actually upheld their constitutionality. They said it's okay to have racially restrictive covenants, and their reasoning was that because racially restrictive covenants were a private action, free from the action of the state, they were constitutional, and white homeowners were given free rein to construct racially restrictive communities through legal agreement. So another way that we see racially restrictive covenants become weaponized is, again, the behavior of real estate brokers in this period. So on the one hand, I don't know how many people have heard of the term blockbusting, but basically what real estate developers and what brokers would do is they would go to a white neighborhood and they would say, you need to sell before it becomes an issue for you to sell, before your value of your home dips because African Americans are moving in. And so the homeowner would sell and flee, and then the broker would flip it at an increased cost to Black people. And so they would get that premium, that delta, as a result. So they were kind of speaking out of both sides of their mouth. On the one hand, they were saying, oh, absolutely, it's common practice, it's the right thing to do to go get a racially restrictive covenant. On the other hand, they were using it to stoke fear and line their own pockets. And then the other thing that was happening in this period is that the FHA, which is a signature program of the New Deal in the 1930s, produced these low interest, fully amortized 20-year loans. And these are like the reason why our American dream of homeownership has been supported for the last 100 years, essentially. And so in their underwriting manual from the 1930s and continuing on for several decades, they actually required racially restrictive covenants to be implemented as a threshold for giving that mortgage. So for developers who are building these large greenfield development sites, in order to finance their property, their development, they actually needed FHA's money, and they needed to sign on to this, even if they didn't agree with it. And actually, there are a couple studies of how hard it was for developers who didn't want to take on racially restrictive covenants to get the financing that they needed in order to build. So, I think it's important to remember where the incentives are here and what it means when the government says, we're not going to give you the money unless you do something, and how that limits your options. Okay, in 1948, the Supreme Court then revisited their decision in 1926, Corrigan v. Buckley, which is pretty unusual, and they actually overturned it. And this time they found that while it was a private agreement between parties, that going to the court to enforce something, so this is where I was talking about what it means to call someone out, basically, for not following their covenant, to go to the state to get them to enforce it was itself a state action. So because it was a state action, now it's in violation of the Constitution. So they overturned Corrigan v. Buckley, and as in 1948, racially restrictive covenants were deemed unenforceable as a matter of law. Notwithstanding that, racially restrictive covenants actually continue to proliferate for the next several years. And there are cases from Missouri, which is where Shelley v. Kramer actually originated, where the court in Missouri was actually upholding and enforcing racially restrictive covenants, even after the Supreme Court declared that they were unenforceable. And part of the thinking about why this might have been was, first of all, people wanted to do it, but also Shelley was perceived to be somewhat weak. And in part, that's because 3 Supreme Court justices had to recuse themselves from the decision because they themselves had racially restrictive covenants on their homes. So I think that goes to the point of how widespread these were. and how it was hard to draw the line of where you are on the side of the issue if your home was also subject to it. So in 1968, there are two things that happen. The first is that the Supreme Court has a case, Jones v. Alfred Mayer Co., where they determined that even private discrimination in the sale or rental property violated law. So they found that it was illegal, not just unenforceable. But this is kind of overshadowed by the fact that the same year, the Federal Fair Housing Act was implemented, and that made it unlawful to refuse to sell, rent to, or negotiate with any person because of that person's inclusion in a protected class, including race. So those things happen right on top of each other, and most people attribute it to the Fair Housing Act, although in some ways, Jones actually says that it was illegal all along, not just because the FHA overruled it, basically. All right.
Nancy, let me just ask a question. Let me just jump in for a second. On these Supreme Court cases, just looking at the years of them, it also seems like they reflect the time, the cultural shift in the country. For example, in 1948, post-World War II, you have explosive economic growth. You have the development of these suburban areas like Levittown and things, or however you say it, in New York and things like that. And then you look at the Jones case in 68, and of course that follows on the heels of the Civil Rights Act and the whole civil rights movement at that time, and then also following on the heels of the urban rioting that went on in Watts, Detroit, and other major cities around that time. And the only reason I bring it up is people look at Supreme Court cases with a name and think that the court is just, as Nancy said, looking at a technical aspect of a transaction, and in reality, with the United States Supreme Court, there's always more to it than that. There's a social push behind what's going on, and not just merely looking at some dry procedural issue that the winds of changes are blowing, and I think that's somewhat of a factor in these cases as well. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree, Jules. And I think we have this kind of myth in our culture that the Supreme Court is up in their ivory tower and that they are, completely wedded to some higher legal principle. And in some cases, there is a higher legal principle at stake, right? But they're also very much responding to the context that they're in. So for example, in 1926, between 1917 and 1926, there was a big spike in the Great Migration. So Black people coming up from the South and going to California and Massachusetts and Detroit and Illinois. And so causing some of that great anxiety. And there were also a number of protests in that period as well. And so there was this general fear amongst white homeowners that not only would they lose value in their home, which was their single greatest asset, right, in terms of economics, but also, general, fear based on no reality but their own imagination, right? And then, like you said, 1948, post-war, we had a real call for Black people to move to these industrial centers and to join the war effort. And there was housing that was provided, but it was provided in much larger amounts to white people who were working in the same effort. And so you had this kind of crunch point right at the end of the war where people were saying, like, I fought in the same war, I did the same things, and yet I am being shut out of these real benefits, including, for example, I mentioned FHA mortgages, but also the VA had some highly desirable mortgages for returning veterans that were not available to a lot of Black servicemen and women. And then, like you said, 1960s, the civil rights era, I think definitely ushered in, not just the Fair Housing Act, but also the Supreme Court's decision in Jones v. Alfred Mayer. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the continuing harm. And I touch on this because I think a few years ago when I first voiced my frustration about racially restrictive covenants, I got feedback that surprised me. And that was, they're not enforceable, they're not illegal, they're illegal. Who cares? What harm are they really causing now? And I would say, I think the best way to think about this are through a couple of pieces. The first is Elise Brody's concept of racial territoriality, and the second is Cheryl Harris's concept of whiteness as property. So Brody's conceptualization of racial discrimination places space at the center of the legal conversation, not as a sideshow, but really at the center. And her thesis is that the law is overly concerned with the racial dynamic between individuals when a primary vehicle of racial discrimination against people of color historically has been the exclusion from white space and institutionalization of that exclusion. And the way that that's been institutionalized are through things like signage or making a space unfriendly to people who are, different skin, differently abled, or not of the same background as more desirable people, right? And so, seen in that light, something like a racially restrictive covenant is exactly one of those symbols, right? And signals to people that you don't belong, this space is not for you, and you're not welcome, right? And Cheryl Harris takes us a step further, which is that she says that not only are race and property historically entwined, which of course they are, but actually they're the same thing. And she says that the law, the creation of rules restricting behavior and allocating property rights in society is integral to maintaining the spatial system. And the power of the state has been deployed to protect white space and to contain non-white space while regulating the movement of people of color within and across various racial borders in service of these objectives. So in this context, the failure of the legal system to account for a racial meaning of space may be connected to a subconscious unwillingness to remedy harms inflicted on people of color in any way that might adversely affect or impact innocent whites. And I put those in scare quotes. Nonetheless, this limitation really limits our ability to remedy these acts of racial discrimination and conceive of this as any way systemic or not just a relationship between two people, right? I included an image here, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you from the news from this year. The woman is actually a lawyer and is on the Board of Ethics in the state of Missouri and maintains that position despite essentially threatening protesters of the Black Lives Movement with her rather petite pistol there. So I think this is something that endures to this day, right? And may also kind of connect the dots as to why homeowners feel some kind of obligation to protect their property from people who don't look like them. So I want to move on to addressing the issue. And this is something that I actually didn't touch much on the article. So, if you've already read the article, I think this is kind of the extension of that. And maybe this is, maybe the main show for some of you. So I included this quote from Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And actually, this is the quote that made me think about why I wanted to say something and do something about racially restrictive covenants. And that is that any nonviolent campaign, there are four basic steps. 1, collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist. 2, negotiation. 3, self-purification. And 4, direct action. So I think we're really still in the fact gathering stage. And, I think here there have been a couple of projects across the US. Some of them are ongoing at the moment, and some of them have already wrapped up. But mapping racially restrictive covenants in communities to demonstrate to people how widespread this is. So I mentioned the one in DC earlier, but there are a number of them. There's one in Louisville, there was one in Charlottesville, there's one in Minneapolis, there's one in Seattle, And actually, I learned recently that there's one in Ann Arbor as well. So if you're looking for one closer to home, there's a group that's doing it there too. And I think, being able to see on a map the true impact of racially restrictive covenants helps you understand the pattern of segregation better, right? Because you can say, oh my gosh, look, I can draw a line between these two neighborhoods. Now I understand why that line is there, right? That there's a real material difference when I step over this border between these communities, and maybe this is something to do with it, right? And then we talked about the second reason that racially restrictive covenants are common is that they become part of the land title in perpetuity. And once that happens, are very difficult and expensive to get rid of. And even though that is true, I personally find that answer very unsatisfactory, right? We had the imagination to create racially restrictive covenants, and therefore we have the obligation to have the imagination to do something about them, right? Just because they're there doesn't mean that we have to live with them. There are a couple of solutions here that already exist, and these are not my suggestions. These are just, other greater thinkers out there have come up with them. So the first is that in his book, The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein comes up with this idea that rather than removing racially restrictive covenants, he recommends modifying the deed instrument by adding a clause that disavows the covenant. So again, this is not a removal of the covenant, but it has a couple of benefits, right? So the first is that it's much easier to do. You can insert it in there pretty quickly with, a small fee at your registry of deeds, and maybe a lawyer's fee if you want to hire a lawyer. But the other benefit, and I think this is really the true one, is that it's kind of like the debate about Civil War generals, right? Doesn't really make a lot of sense to have a statue celebrating a Civil War general in the middle of a public space in a city that has nothing to do with that general, right? But that doesn't mean that there isn't a value to understanding the history of who that person is, first of all, and then also why there's a statue in their honor, who caused that to be the case, right? And so rather than removing it or, getting rid of it entirely, you move it to a place where you can provide more context, right? And so that's kind of the equivalent on racially restrictive covenants, right? Where you're inserting something that says, I know this exists and I think it's wrong. And so you're calling something out, you're educating yourself about why it's there, and you're educating future buyers as well to say, look, this is something that we did collectively as a society, and I am standing up and saying, I don't believe in this. And, I will say, there's some evidence that we need to do some better educating of ourselves, right? So I think that, it's not to be dismissed out of hand, to do this instead of removing it, right? That said, if you want to remove it, there are a number of states that have either passed or are considering legislation that would make it easier to do so. And it was Oregon in 2018 passed a law that allowed property owners to remove racially restrictive covenants from their deed by petitioning the county's circuit court without a fee. So this makes it a much more streamlined process, a much more affordable process for people who want to remove their covenants to do so, right? And actually, there have been some kind of similar movements in Illinois. State Rep Dydick, I'm not actually sure how to pronounce his name, proposed a similar bill this summer, and actually a couple of people about that and asked me, if he had reached out about what language would be appropriate. And then also in Michigan, Representative Anthony introduced a bill in 2019 that would make it easier for Michigan Condominium Association and homeowners associations to remove those discriminatory provisions from their covenant declaration or master deed. All right, so I'm going to move on to questions, but in just a second. But I just want to say
before you do that, though, I'm your moderator here, so I just want to pose an issue, if you will, with regard to your last comment. With respect to, for most people, the purchase of a home is one of the biggest investments they make in their life, and it's one of the largest assets that they hold. And also, anybody who's purchased a home knows all the hoops that you have to jump through with respect to buying it. The title, have to have title insurance, there has to be a title search, there can't be any clouds on the title, things like that. When Nancy and I were talking about this issue before, you know, I said that I would be extremely cautious about doing, no matter how well intentioned the person may be, and say, I can't stand the thought that the deed to my house has language like that in its title history. That's fine, but understanding that doing anything with regard to the title on the property that could at the time of a future sale or something like that cause somebody to say, well, was this done? What is this? Well, you know, why are we, why is there an entry with regard to the chain of title where nothing's happened? Like Barbara and I have lived in this house for 31 years, and all of a sudden something shows up in 2020 or 2021 that is an addendum or an amendment, or I'm not even sure what you would call it. We'd have to get somebody from the Register of Deeds office in Oakland County to actually tell us what we should do. But I would just caution that it's while it may seem like a good idea, I mean, this you know, real estate's an industry, and almost anything you do that triggers a light or causes a light to go on somewhere, it can be problematic when you'd say, well, that's not what it was meant to be. So I'm not here to say whether it's a good idea to do it. I can see why many people would feel it was. I don't think it changes anything. Like Nancy says, it's here. It's part of the history of the time. We have houses in Huntington Woods that, you know, go back to the, you know, the 20s and even earlier. So there's no doubt that those restrictions are there. You know they're there. But I would just, my own personal counsel would be that this isn't something that I go on legal Zoom and look for a form or something for, because it can cause a lot of headaches.
No, that's absolutely right, Jules, and thank you for mentioning that. So I would definitely not say that this is a time for self-help. If you're interested in doing this, I would talk to a good lawyer and make sure that you do this appropriately and make sure that you're not jeopardizing the financeability or saleability of your home in the future. And I also say that, you know, like I kind of said at the beginning, either putting this in your deed or going out of your way to get it removed is not going to solve the underlying issue, right? And here I come back to, what is the purpose of all this, right? Is the purpose just to erase something that was done as a society, or is it to call attention to it and say, this is a real problem and it's had these real consequences, including, for example, not just segregation of homes, but segregation of schools and, you know, the accumulation of generational wealth. These have had lasting impacts, right? And so it's a kind of a moment to say this is a small tool in systemic racism, and it has had major impacts. But overall, you know, systemic racism is its own bigger issue. This is not going to solve that, right? And so, you know, I would encourage you, if this is something that's interesting to you, do your research, follow some of these mapping exercises that organizations are putting together. If you really want to do something about it, talk to a lawyer, like Jules mentioned, and, you know, talk about putting something in or trying to remove it, or try to get involved in legislative efforts. Regardless, I would say, at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we're doing this thoughtfully, because the way that this was done was very intentional and very thoughtful in a very negative and far-reaching way, right? So we want to make sure that we're not just reaching for the silver bullet and coming up with the best or most the easiest answer, should we say, because that's not going to solve the problem. All right, and with that, I don't know, Jules, if you have any other questions or anything else you want to talk about, but that's it from my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions that someone might have.
So anybody who's on who wants to, and what do they got to do? Send you a signal that
Oh, and I think you're muted.
And you're muted. Yeah.
Okay, there is, just put a question in the chat box, but there is a comment from Claire. And the comment is, early on, covenants were aimed at immigrants as well as religion and race.
No, that's true. It varied a lot by community, right? What that particular community's fear was, and what they were trying to address. And I hate to use that word because I don't think address is really right, but what they were scared about, right? Who their boogeyman was.
You know, it's interesting in Nancy's article, she points out that, you know, you would think that these covenants grew out of the South, and actually, I think you point out in your article that California and Massachusetts were two states where they were prolific.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you'd look at it and think that this must be something right out of, Mississippi in the 1930s or something, but it's funny that a state like California and a state like Massachusetts, which most people tend to think are more, more progressive and so forth historically, would have been such epicenters for it.
No, that's absolutely right. I think we have this idea that more liberal places have always been more liberal and continue to be more liberal on all topics, right? But, I think mainly the reason why I grew out of California and Massachusetts in particular was that those were centers of the Great Migration. So people moving from the South up to the North. And so places that like to think of themselves as being more liberal because they were on the right side of the Civil War were nonetheless suddenly confronted with their own racism, right? And then also Boston had, huge migration from Europe and some other places as well. So also had those kinds of restrictions appearing as well. So no Irish people, no Italians.
There's a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Could you address mapping projects a little more, please? Is it mapping neighborhoods for where there's a cluster of these covenants?
So they vary in scope based on the project. But essentially, yes, they're looking at deeds over time and saying, like kind of physically marking them on a map. There's one here. And in some cases, what's interesting about it is you can really see how they came to be in that neighborhood, right? So was it a greenfield development where every house on a tract of 500 properties has the same restriction, or was this a community which was already in existence at the time that these covenants were starting to proliferate? And so these were neighbors, doing this among themselves ad hoc.
Okay. And then another question in regards to the Oregon streamline process, does this run the risk of skipping over the collection of facts to determine whether injustices exist?
Yeah, I personally think that any action like that does run that risk. And that's why I would prefer that we all have this conversation, in a serious and thoughtful way before jumping to a solution, because I don't really think that the solution is the end goal, right? I don't think that getting rid of them or just saying that they're bad is really the solution. I think really the solution is processing why they're there and what that means for our society today.
Are there any other questions out there? Ann?
Not yet. Oh, here's another one. This is from Steve. We're essentially all homeowners associations like ours in Huntington Woods, which is a year older than the city's incorporation, had a purpose of strengthening racially restrictive covenants?
So no, I would not say that that's across the board the case. There are lots of totally legit reasons to have a homeowners association, for example, dealing with the trash, or, I don't live in a place with a homeowners association, but a lot of people want to live in a place where everything is aesthetically pleasing, or where they feel like they have some kind of neighborliness or some kind of common purpose. And that is really the true purpose of a homeowners association. The negative side of that is where you're trying to maintain your community by restricting people from entering it, right? And I think actually the Huntington Woods one, I think what I looked at from Amy, it does actually have that racially restrictive covenant in it. And, this is kind of a fine line as well, because there are some people out there who will say that homeowners associations are themselves problematic, right? Because you are restricting the way that someone else can use their property, or you're trying to impose your opinions about what a neighborhood should look like on others. I'm not going to enter that fight because, I'm not a homeowner. I don't own a home in a homeowners association. And I personally haven't had any bad experiences, but I have heard that some people have that objection.
Okay, and here's another. Do you know I don't know how to pronounce this first name, ASEAN Suite case on Detroit's east side? If you're familiar, were racially restrictive covenants a factor?
I do not know that case. I'm going to look it up though.
It was a case where a Black physician bought a home in Detroit. And if I recall correctly, there was an armed assault on him and his family, and he defended the property and he was criminally charged. And if I recall correctly, Clarence Darrow represented him in the case in Detroit in Recorder's Court. This is, I'm not sure of the years, but the house is designated as a historic site, and it's a landmark. It's not just a landmark case, but it was a landmark occurrence in the sense that the question was whether this individual could be criminally charged as a result of having defended his property from an armed assault from people who didn't want him in the neighborhood. As to whether or not there was a written restrictive covenant, I guess when an armed militia shows up, I guess that really doesn't make any difference, but it's a historically significant case in the civil rights movement, and it's a very historic case here in Detroit in the history of the city.
Yeah, and so here I would say, I'm not familiar with the case clearly, but maybe there you're seeing the interaction between what the covenant is saying is permitted and people's, if there was a covenant there, the expectation of your ability as a white person to enforce it through, violence or other actions, right? Some kind of sense of entitlement to protect your white space.
Yeah, well,
you can have that without a restrictive covenant. Quite frankly.
I can tell you that I grew up in Northwest Detroit, and I can tell you that when I actually did see the title history of my parents' home, which was built right after World War II, there was a clear racial and religious restrictive covenant in it about not selling the house, not allowing anybody who was Black or not allowing Jews to purchase the property. So this was not something that was endemic to the suburbs. This was urban areas. It was everywhere. And it is interesting, your comment about the blockbusting, because for those of us who bore witness to that in the city of Detroit, particularly after, I was talking to Nancy about it earlier, after the 1967 riot, particularly I recall the area around Cooley High School, Hubble and Finkel in Northwest Detroit. There was an African-American real estate agent who was actively involved in that activity, approaching white homeowners and telling them they better get serious about selling their home because what's going to happen to your neighborhood. And that kind of blockbusting went on right in front of our eyes at that time, and was very significant in creating them, in forcing the migration of white residents out of the city at a faster rate. So it's interesting that you brought that, because in Nancy's article, she brings out, like I said, real estate's an industry, and there's a lot of people that feed off of it. And she points out how, real estate agents, and that's not to say, we're not talking about now, but at that time, that it was there was an economic incentive for that industry for that. So, it's so I commend the article to you. It's very well written, and like I said, it's not written in a way that you need to be a real estate lawyer to understand. It's a periodical article, and I strongly recommend it.
Another question from Steve. My home in Huntington Woods was built in 1950. No document has a restrictive covenant. Does the fact surprise you or mean anything about the developer's perspective?
Not necessarily. It may just mean that the developer was better capitalized and didn't need to rely on, loans that were requiring it, right? In fact, actually, the FHA did continue to require these covenants even after Shelley. So yes, at this point, racially restrictive covenants would have been deemed unenforceable. But even in this period where they were very common, there were still things that are being built without them. The statistic is generally about half of all buildings were built in that period did have that covenant, but clearly you're one of the ones that didn't have it, one of the half. Wouldn't the HOA act as, yeah, so if you have an HOA and your home is in an HOA, you would be bound by the HOA. So I don't know if that applies to Steve's home, but. Real estate steering, yeah, no, it does fit into it. And that was kind of what I was talking about. So the question is, how does real estate steering fit into underlying restrictive covenants? So this kind of dovetails with what I was talking about with the behavior of real estate brokers and the period, which was that on the one hand, they were encouraging white homeowners to sell their homes in the city and move out to these new suburbs through their fear of white flight. And then also on the other end, where they could also put in these restrictions that, you're moving to these nice white suburbs that have already ensured that your home value will be protected. And on the other hand, they're steering in, Black and other members of the community to the home in the urban center that is now up at a premium, right? So these brokers were steering certain groups of people to certain places. Yeah.
Anybody else? Ann? Should we wrap? There are no other questions. I guess we can wrap it up. I'm grateful to everybody who came on tonight to participate in this. Like I said, it's intended as an educational effort to promote discussion and to promote positive social change. I appreciate Amy Sullivan's help tonight in organizing it and Ann's help in getting it coordinated, and most particularly as now an honorary resident of Huntington Woods, Nancy Welsh's willingness to spend all the time that she spent preparing for this. It's a lot to ask somebody to knock on their door and say, hey, how'd you like to spend time with residents in Huntington Woods and everything like that. And she did that willingly, and we appreciate her scholarship, her knowledge, and her efforts. I think it's a very good start to a program that Ann and the city are working on to try to promote, like I said, education, discussion, and positive change. So
thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, I guess everybody can depart. Go look at your deeds right now to see what's there.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Bye.